Hey guys, I had to take a break from my current series to address Dyer, our favorite YouTube apologist, who has been a rant of late against the Roman Catholic Church on the matter of the Filioque. So I'll just say this, I agree with Jay. I agree with Jay's critique of the Roman Catholic Church on the Filioque. I agree that Rome is guilty of positing a dialectic of opposition on the origination of the Son and Spirit from the Father. I mean, as it regards the Spirit originating from two principles, the Father and the Son, or from the common nature that is shared between the Father and the Son, depending on how you approach it. That is intrinsically problematic and does render Rome guilty of absolute divine simplicity. The problem with Jay's rant, however, is that he and all of Christendom, regardless of the tradition, is guilty of absolute divine simplicity. They just come at it from a different angle. So, when you have a God, as monotheism does, that is classical monotheism, that is totally separate and other from the world, you no longer have a God that is infinite. So even if you want to keep asserting that the world has its origin in God, that it comes from God, that it comes out of God in some sense, as long as you keep insisting that the world is ontologically other, as long as you keep insisting that there is an absolute binary separation between God and the world, you're stuck with a finite God. Because if God is not all that there is, if all that there is not God, then God is just another thing existing over and against something else, namely creation. So you have this duality that is unsolvable, rendering the Trinity a sort of closed, localized system which can do none other than collapse in on itself. Therefore, ergo, absolute divine simplicity. So the Trinity becomes no different from St. Patrick's imperfect analogy of the Trinity as a three-leaf clover. You can, until you're blue in the face, you can protest that it's just an analogy and it's not perfect and that's not really how the Trinity works. But as long as you are insisting that God and creation are totally separate, then all you have is a localized, finite entity in which the persons have to collapse in on themselves one way or another. Now, Rome does it by positing the Filioque clause, and the East does it. I don't think you even need to go beyond the critique of classical monotheism as radically dual to make the point. But Rome also has, I think, Rome has a fair criticism when it says, okay, great, you think you have the answer, but what is the relationship? What is the eternal relationship between the Son and the Holy Spirit? And I know that the East will try to say that they'll come up with some jargon about the Spirit resting upon the Son and so forth. Now, I don't see how you can get out of that being anything other than an economical relation. Excuse me, got some allergies. An economical relationship. How do you explain that relationship in eternity? Other than to say that the Son and Spirit have a common origin from the Father. But if that's as far as you're able to go, that the Son and Spirit have a common origin from the Father, ultimately you're reducing the three persons collectively to the divine essence. You're basically saying the Father is the common point of unity. So how is he distinct from the essence? So non-dualism solves all of these problems because God is simply eternally emanating all beings from himself in the way that the Spirit and the Son are eternally caused from the Father within Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The only difference is that non-dualists extend this to everything that exists. Rather than to just two persons in a monotheistic trinity, it's extending this to all being and all beings. When God is therefore liberated of this sort of localized limiting finite conception of him, there's no longer the difficulty of having to explain how he is infinite while yet being set apart as something separate from the creation. So it's very simple. If God, and I've posed this question to Jay under his channel, and as usual, he just ignores me, but if there is anything that is not God, God is not infinite. It's very simple. I've even posed this question to a priest through text messages, and he wouldn't even address it. He would address everything except that question. And there's a reason for that. So I don't know that there's a whole lot more I can add to this. I mean, I could go on all day in one sense because the metaphysics of this are so rich and we could look at it from like 15 different angles. But for the purpose of making my basic point, I think I have pretty much addressed everything. The idea is not that God is reducible. The non-dual perspective is not reducible to God being the creation. The paradox is that creation is God, creation is an extension of God, but at the same time, God transcends creation because he is its origin and source, its eternal origin and source. So if you balance that, if you have that balanced understanding, if you are able to hold that paradox in tension, which remember, a paradox is not a contradiction. If you're able to hold that paradox, it solves every metaphysical problem you could possibly run into. The God of classical monotheism cannot solve the problem that their God is in diametrical opposition to creation. So they have a dialectic of opposition involving God. It involves the relationship of God to the world. It is a dialectic of opposition. The same problem that the Roman Catholic Church has with their Trinity. So as a result, the Trinity becomes localized. Therefore, the persons in one way or another have to collapse back into the oneness. And then, therefore, you have no ground for personhood. So classical monotheism is utterly bankrupt. It doesn't matter what perspective you come at it. Doesn't matter what angle you look at it from. It doesn't matter whether you're coming out of the Western tradition or the Eastern tradition. You have to be able to answer the question, how can God be said to be the origin or source of all creation while holding to this, simultaneously to this doctrine of creation ex nihilo, where everything literally comes out of nothing? That's a contradiction. Nothing comes from nothing. Everything comes from God. Okay, so they're saying that Everything has its origin in God, but at the same time, it comes out of nothing. Well, unless you're going to take the position that God is nothing, everything comes from God. And therefore, since God is eternal, everything is eternal, okay? But it is eternal in the sense that it is still subordinate to God as origin, as cause. And this is why, in order to be consistent, the Orthodox Church has to recognize that if you're going to posit the eternal causation of the Son and Spirit from the Father, you have to recognize that the Son and Spirit are ultimately subordinate to the Father. Again, because we critiqued this to death, like, a year ago. You can't have a position that two persons are eternally caused by another person within the Trinity, and at the same time claim that all three persons are co-equal with one another. So again, the non-dual position is simply this: everything eternally proceeds from God, and yet is subordinate to God because it comes from him, because it has its source in him, whereas he doesn't have a source. He is from all eternity. He just is. So there is a distinction. There's a distinction between God as source and everything else which has its source in him, while at the same time all is divine because it has its being from God. The classical theistic or classical monotheistic view is trying to have its cake and eat it too when it says that that God is the source of origin of all things, and yet it is absolutely other. Well, you're giving an ontological independence to creation. And if you're going to grant an ontological independence to creation, then creation could not have proceeded from God at all. It would be a separate and distinct God. We would be talking about two co-eternal principles, two things that are co-eternal with one another and yet independent of each other, like two gods. So, so unfortunately, because of this radical separation between creation and God that you find in classical monotheism, you either have to have everything collapse in on itself to where there are no distinctions at all. You'd have to have a radical monism, or you would have to have this radical dualism, which is the product of creation ex nihilo. So I would love for Jay to respond to this video and come out of the closet here and show that he can actually respond to someone who is metaphysically capable, rather than dealing with all this low-hanging fruit that serves as great entertainment value but doesn't really get us any closer to understanding the truth. Have a great day, guys. See you later. Bye.